years alone, get this now, nearly $700 million in cold, hard cash was stuffed into suitcases and flown out of Minneapolis. $700 million. That is 14,000 pounds of $100 bills in suitcases, flown out of our country overseas. We're going to hear testimony that American taxpayers nationwide are losing north of $1 trillion a year in government programs. That's the Pentagon's entire budget. $1 trillion a year. This isn't isolated crooks gaming the system. I wish it were. It's transnational criminal syndicates siphoning money out of America. 70% of that loot flows overseas.
For years, they thought they could hide it in plain sight, behind hearings, behind paperwork, behind polished talking points. But today, Josh Hawley walked into that room and did what almost nobody in Washington is willing to do. He forced the truth into the open. What you're about to watch is not just another Senate exchange. It's the exact moment the script broke down. The excuses stopped working. The answers started falling apart. And the people who thought they were untouchable suddenly looked very, very nervous. Whether it's taxpayer fraud, child safety, or another buried scandal, Hawley has one pattern. He keeps pushing until the mask comes off. And once it does, there's no going back. If you're tired of the lies, the cover-ups, and the same elite excuses, hit subscribe right now because this may be the moment everything changed. Let's get into it.
And how the integrity of our political system is being protected. We're going to hear testimony that tens of billions of dollars intended to serve the public have been lost to fraud in the state of Minnesota alone. Organized criminal syndicates stole COVID-era disaster money to the tune of billions of dollars, and since then they have defrauded money from every single federally funded program in the state of Minnesota. Let me say that again. Every single federally funded program in the state of Minnesota. Programs intended for children, for the elderly, for the poor, for the sick, for the most vulnerable Americans. We're going to hear testimony that $9 billion has been defrauded in Minnesota from Medicaid alone. $9 billion. Vanishing into luxury cars, overseas vacations, billions going to fund foreign adversaries, billions shipped out of the country. In the last 2 years alone, get this now, nearly $700 million in cold, hard cash was stuffed into suitcases and flown out of Minneapolis. $700 million. That is 14,000 pounds of $100 bills in suitcases, flown out of our country overseas. We're going to hear testimony that American taxpayers nationwide are losing north of $1 trillion a year in government programs. That's the Pentagon's entire budget. $1 trillion a year. This isn't isolated crooks gaming the system. I wish it were. It's transnational criminal syndicates siphoning money out of America. 70% of that loot flows overseas, funding cartels, terrorists, adversaries like North Korea, China, Iran, Russia. Money meant for American grandparents, working families, the elderly, the sick, is instead funding organized crime, arming our enemies, and subsidizing the trafficking of children. And the threats don't end there. In recent weeks, we have seen anti-ICE protests escalate into outright lawlessness. What we're going to hear testimony about today is these were not spontaneous protests in many cases. It's manufactured chaos. And who is behind it? Dark money networks and foreign actors, some of whom have ties to the Chinese Communist Party. We're going to hear testimony that these activities are funded and coordinated by a dense network of nonprofits and foreign-linked actors who use layer upon layer of pass-through entities to hide the money trail. A classic dark money laundering, to take foreign money and foreign influence and to dump it into our political system. It's sort of like Riot Incorporated. Pre-planned tactics designed not to protest, but to destabilize, to erode faith in our institutions, and to force political change through manufactured crises. Listen, at the end of the day, this hearing is about a simple question. Is our government equipped to safeguard? Mr. Talcove is the CEO of LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Mr. Talcove, the floor is yours.
Chairman Hawley, Ranking Member Kim, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I have spent my career working to protect taxpayers and our most vulnerable from organized criminal groups who exploit our country's generosity and kindness. I have worked with the Secret Service on investigations and felt the personal impact fraud has on loved ones like my 84-year-old mother who lives in Florida. This country has built a social safety net grounded on a pledge. When Americans face hardship through disaster, job loss, or crisis, their government will respond with speed, fairness, and dignity. In my remarks, I will focus on the scale of the fraud crisis and key solutions we can implement to stop it. The United States government is ripe for exploitation and likely the single largest funder of cybercrime in the world. Fraud in government programs is significant. It materially undermines the financial health of the country and contributes meaningfully to the nation's $38 trillion national debt. These are not your constituents. These are real criminals stealing real tax dollars, using fake companies and stolen identities. The scale of the problem is real. The GAO places losses at over $500 billion a year. Secretary Bessent estimates losses of up to $600 billion a year, around 2% of GDP, while I put the number closer to $1 trillion annually, or $115 million every single hour, of which 70% is related to transnational criminals. Others have placed the number as high as $1.5 trillion. Over the last decade, taxpayers have lost anywhere between $7 to $12 trillion to these criminal organizations stealing from our benefit programs. We now spend more on fraud than we spend on servicing the national debt or the defense budget. Fraud is a national security issue. It is a fiscal crisis. It is a betrayal of the people these programs are meant to serve, and it impacts the trust your constituents have in their government and its leadership. The problem is not new, but it's been escalating. It started with Hurricane Katrina, when benefits were provided with no controls. The criminals learned that government was a soft target. It never runs out of money. You have a low chance of being caught, less than 0.1%, and pay and chase does not work. The pandemic then took fraud to the next level. Domestic and transnational criminal organizations steal and manufacture identities and companies, share data and best practices on the dark web, exploit complicated eligibility systems, and move cash around borders to foreign adversaries. These actors are sophisticated, they are dangerous, and they operate in all 50 states. They weaponize our compassion against programs we consider too vital to question. They know officials will hesitate to scrutinize aid meant for people in desperate need. They exploit our best instincts to commit their worst crimes. This is not a flaw in the system. It is a feature of how these criminal enterprises operate. The core problem has a name: self-attestation. Programs that operate on the honor system invite exploitation by transnational criminal groups. This is the first time in my career that I have confidence we can effectively counter threats to the most vulnerable while also protecting hard-earned tax dollars. I want to commend the administration for establishing a new Department of Justice leadership position focused on fraud enforcement, and the United States Secret Service for its support work, especially in the SNAP program. Their involvement shows that when federal resources are applied, criminal networks can be shut down. If we want to save $1 trillion annually and restore trust, we must change how we do business before it's too late. These are my 4 recommendations. First, front-end identity verification like that used in the private sector. Second, enforce mandatory recertification and continuous validation for every current recipient of an entitlement. Third, independent third-party audits. Fourth, the use of federal law enforcement. These fixes are easy. The technology and the data exist and are used every day by commercial entities. Let me be clear. Fraud prevention is not benefit prevention. Integrity is not the opposite of compassion. It is what makes compassion sustainable. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next up is Mr. Seamus Bruner. Mr. Bruner is the Vice President at the Government Accountability Institute. Go ahead, Mr. Bruner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ranking member and members of the committee, thank you. I want to build directly on the testimony we just heard regarding pervasive fraud in state-administered, federally funded benefit programs. As Senator Corrin and Mr. Talcove described, What we are seeing in Minnesota is not isolated misconduct. It is systemic fraud enabled by weak oversight, fragmented authority, and a benefits architecture that allows large sums of taxpayer assistance to be distributed with minimal verification and little consequence for abuse. What is important for the committee to understand is that the nonprofit and NGO systems operating around these benefit programs do not exist in isolation. They are part of a broader ecosystem that links migration, government benefits, political mobilization, and, when challenged, organized disruption. Put simply, these anti-ICE disruptions are not isolated protest activity, but part of a larger interconnected system involving migration, government benefits, and political mobilization. At the front end of this system, nonprofit and NGO networks facilitate and incentivize mass migration by navigating access to government benefits and services for the migrants, what we refer to as Migrant Inc. The benefits themselves do not flow into these NGOs. Instead, they function as a form of patronage, creating dependency among migrant populations and anchoring them to nonprofit intermediaries that manage information, access, and ongoing engagement. That dependency is the leverage. It keeps populations embedded within an organizational ecosystem operating in environments of weak oversight and limited enforcement, conditions we've clearly seen in Minnesota. These same nonprofit ecosystems then transition into political mobilization, voter registration, ballot education, turnout operations, and sustained civic engagement, what we call Election Inc. While often presented as nonpartisan activity, in practice, this functions as a durable political infrastructure, maintaining communications networks and organizational capacity that persist across election cycles and reliably align with particular political outcomes. Importantly, many of these large NGO networks operating across these stages rely on complex and opaque funding structures, including donor-advised funds, fiscal sponsorships, and international financing streams, some of which trace back to foreign nationals and foreign-connected entities. These arrangements are designed to obscure the true source of funding.
Thank you very much. Thanks to each of the witnesses. Now we will turn to questions. We will alternate sides, Democrat, Republican. We'll start with me. We're going to do 7-minute questioning rounds. Let me just start with you, Senator Corn, if I could. I'm sure you're familiar with the recent anti-ICE protests in Minnesota. Let me just ask you this. From your vantage point in the state, are the majority of these protests spontaneous or more organized? What is your impression? You're there.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. They're highly organized and coordinated.
What evidence of that? What data? What signs have you observed that would indicate some level of coordination?
Well, in Minnesota, we've seen a wide variety of coordinated efforts. The agitation groups on the ground, there are a wide variety of them, some national, some very professional, in addition to local reports that state they've trained some 30,000 observers to get in and get in the middle of the protests.
And how would you describe the tactics that are used during these protests that you've observed? Peaceful, aggressive, inciting violence, trying to draw a reaction? I mean, again, you're on the ground, so you tell us.
Yeah, what we've seen is a whole host of doxing, highly coordinated efforts in doxing. We've seen instances of violence against federal agents. I think in 2 cases we've had agents that one had their finger bitten off and they've been pelted with frozen bottles, stones, and every other type of thing, in addition to directly interfering with legal law enforcement.
Let me ask you this. Have you seen any evidence that state officials are cooperating or coordinating with these efforts in any manner?
Yes, we've seen there are a variety of state officials, elected officials that represent the Minneapolis area that have gotten involved. Some are on the chat box, the chats out there. We've got one representative, very proud, Brad Tabke is a representative out there proud, making sure to help train and coordinate those efforts.
Mr. Rimmer, can I just turn to you? Senator Corn has said that he has seen coordinated efforts within his state to disrupt ICE, including lookout signal chats, et cetera. Your organization specializes in following nonprofit funding and organizational networks. So based on your research, What organizations have been active on the ground in Minnesota? What can you tell us?
Yes, we have tracked over $60 million, according to the latest 990 disclosures, to approximately 14 groups, some of them national, others on the ground. Groups like the ACLU provide the legal defense, as well as facilitate the trainings for some of the tactics that Senator Corrin just described. A group named Democracy Forward. Take Action Minnesota has gotten over $10 million from these large NGO networks, including the Neville Roy Singham Network, Indivisible, National Lawyers Guild, CTUL, the Council on American Islamic Relations Minnesota, CARE, Minnesota 350, Voices for Racial Justice, on and on. Like I said, over $60 million just according to the latest 990 disclosures.
$60 million, at least 14 different groups. That sounds like a pretty broad ecosystem here. Where's this money coming from? I mean, how is it flowing to these groups? Do you have any sense? So
we've built a database that contains hundreds of thousands of rows from grants from networks like the Soros Network, the Arabella Funding Network, as mentioned, the Neville Roy Singham Funding Network, many others, Tides, the Ford Foundation Network, the Rockefeller Funding Network, these massive NGOs that have billions of dollars to spend on all kinds of coordinated protest, or in this case, riot activity.
Give us a sense, if you could, of how this money flows to the ground level. You know, how does it get from these various donors and come down to ground level and start funding protests and other violent activity?
It comes in the form of a check, a six-figure check. That'll come from whether it's the Open Society or the Tides groups, the Singham groups. They'll fund directly some of these on-the-ground organizations. And we've seen this happen time and again. It's not just in Minnesota.
So the money, I think we've got a chart perhaps, the money gets moved around. You just referenced a number of these groups, Arabella Advisors, the Tides groups. These are left-wing dark money groups. So you've got this incredible, I mean, just look at the number of different entities on this one chart, all of this money moving through all of these different groups, many of them, again, non-disclosed donors, right? So we don't know exactly where the donors ultimately come from. Oftentimes the entity that gets the money doesn't have to report where they get the money. So it's washed through multiple times. And what you're saying is your research has found multiple different left-wing groups that are funding these protests on the ground in Minnesota. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. And the foreign money is probably the most concerning, whether it's from Neville Roy Singham or the Swiss billionaire Hans-Jörg Wyss.
Okay, talk about that. Talk about the foreign money, because you've mentioned Singham now a couple of times. There was a New York Post article not long ago talking about Neville Singham, who's based, I think, in China. Tell us what your research has uncovered about this foreign money making its way to American protests that often harm our law enforcement officers.
Sure. So Neville Roy Singham, he's an American citizen. He's an avowed Marxist, and he made nearly $1 billion roughly a decade ago selling his tech company. One of the funds that purchased the tech company had Chinese sovereign wealth money in it. And once he sold that company, again, got close to $1 billion, he now uses that money to fund a variety of protest, riot, anti-Semitic protests, the pro-Hamas things in New York. He funded the LA riots earlier this year. And so he lives in China, is a pro-CCP guy, and he's not done. He's also got very close ties to the communists in Cuba. He finances trips for American groups to go down to Cuba to receive Marxist revolutionary training. They come back here, and then they operate on the ground. Famously, one of the groups in Salt Lake City, the Armed Queers of Salt Lake City, they went down to Cuba and got one of these trips. They're also very anti-ICE and working on these anti-ICE demonstrations.
So let me just make sure I understand. You're telling me that protest, quote unquote, protest activity we've seen in Los Angeles, we've seen in Minnesota, we've seen in other places that often turns violent, that some of this, maybe much of it, is funded by overseas money, including by this individual who has ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's right. You can see on the on a lot of the placards, when you see all these placards roll out, Party for Socialism and Liberation, other groups like that, the Democratic Socialists of America. These are not organic, spontaneous. They got thousands and thousands of signs that get pointed out. Those are all within the Singham network.
Let me just finish with this. You mentioned another major source of foreign money. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Hans-Jörg Wyss, he's a Swiss billionaire. The New York Times reported this. He's one of the largest funders of the Arabella network of funds. He pledged to give $200 million to electing people in the United States. Many people have wondered how is a foreigner allowed to fund political operations. Thus far has escaped, hey, there's been some investigations, but not enough.
This is exactly the kind of thing that Alexander Hamilton all those years ago warned about when he warned about the danger of foreign influence and foreign adversaries in our elections, and we're seeing it play out in real time. Senator Kim, I'll turn it over to you. Senator Cornyn, let me just come back to you. I want to get a handle here on just the scale of the fraud in Minnesota. We talked about the dark money groups funding much of what's going on the ground, but let's just get a handle here on the scale of the fraud. You are a member, I want to get this right, of the the Office of the Legislative Auditor. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, of the Legislative Audit Commission.
Audit Commission, got it. You oversee the Office of the Legislative Auditor. Okay, got it. So you've got access to all of this information. Give me your best estimate based on the information you've seen, the audits you've seen. How many of the agencies, 20 or so agencies, I think, in the state of Minnesota, public agencies, how many have rampant fraud?
All of them are wrapped up in some sort that can issue. There's 20 primary state agencies in state law. Of the largest, there are 10 of our largest primary agencies. Many of the nonprofits receive grants and funding from all 10 agencies.
If you had to put a number on it, based on what you've seen, your work, your investigations, the audits that you've seen, what do you think the total losses are to Minnesotans in terms of fraud?
I think the conservative number is what our federal investigators have determined. Of just the 14 Medicaid programs, that half of all of it would be about $9 billion. And I don't think that's, and I think the reason I believe that's true is in each audit that the legislative auditor produces, we measure right level in the samples of what they have done. 20 to 80% of each one of them, they're unable to prove that the dollars were actually have gone to the programs in which they're indicated.
$9 billion. How much of this money has left Minnesota for overseas?
Well, I arrived in 2017. The Child Care Assistance Program fraud, for which the program, I believe, is $130 million. The whistleblowers showed us that they believe $100 million of that was fraudulent. We had a whistleblower come forward, actually publicly, and at that time we also discovered something new to me, which is the Hawala process of the movement of cash through our airports in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And what I've come to learn, and that year it was just coincidentally $100 million in fraud, suspected fraud, and $100 million went out in cash through the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. I've learned that.
Tell us how that worked. $100 million in cash through the airport.
In suitcases, back then it was $1 million out of crack. And so I've learned that in the year before it was about $74 million. Secretary Bessent I've tried for 2.5 years to get that number because I wanted to get a view of how many excess dollars are sent out from the program, from the community that's sending them. And in the last 2 years, it was $340 million each year. And so if you look at it, it's about a 25% increase over this period from 2017. That's $1.8 billion in cash. And I don't think the average citizen who works for their money understands how complicated it is to ship or to obtain $6 to $7 million of cash every single week of the year. And our federal government certainly must have been aware of it and has done nothing to look at it. But that's just all but about $130 million, I think, is originated out of Minnesota.
But what every American taxpayer absolutely understands is their federal tax money being taken on suitcases out of this country to go heaven knows where. I mean, if that's not infuriating, I don't know what is. And the fact that it is systemic in Minnesota, and probably to your testimony, Mr. Talco, probably systemic in a lot of other places. I mean, millions of dollars in suitcases out of an airport, and that's just one means of shipping this money around. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. I want to come back to you, Mr. Talco. You testified that about $1 trillion you think is lost in fraud every year. Where is this money going? I mean, we know where some of it's going in Minnesota. It went overseas. It went to Somalia. It went to NGO fronts. We know where it's gone in some other states. California gave away billions of dollars to a pro-Hamas NGO. But $1 trillion nationally, where's this money going to?
I appreciate that question because most people don't ask that question. It goes to terrorism. It goes to child trafficking. It goes to drugs. It goes to terrorism. And then it's used to purchase luxury items, cars, purses, homes. That's all funded by people like me that pay taxes.
So you're telling me that the electrician who goes to work every day and clocks in and works his butt off and tries to earn just enough to be able to, make his rent, maybe have a kid or two, put food on the table, his tax money is being used to buy other people luxury items, cars, yachts, whatever else, and is going to fund terrorism and child trafficking?
Yes, sir.
$1 trillion a year on this stuff?
$115 million an hour.
$115 million an hour. How do they get in their hands on it? What are we talking about here? Transnational organizations, criminal networks? How do they get their hands on this money?
They take advantage of antiquated government systems and processes. They go into programs that they know elected and appointed officials won't touch, and they can steal at scale. And what happened really was during the pandemic, between the PPP loans and the unemployment insurance, they learned a really valuable lesson. Government never runs out of money, and the probability of getting caught is virtually zero. I have it at 0.1%.
So come back to the recommendations that you mentioned in your opening statement. What do we need to do to put a stop to this hemorrhaging of people's hard-earned money going overseas to finance child trafficking and luxury yachts? I mean, what needs to happen here?
It's really simple. It's used every single day in the commercial sector. Front-end identity verification, you just don't get to say, I am who I say I am. Second, recertification of all the recipients. There is so much fraud right now in the benefit programs all across the country. We need to get a baseline. Third, this notion of a third-party independent audit. And finally, is involving federal law enforcement, like the Secret Service, to investigate it. The thing that people don't understand is that most of these beneficiaries, Senator, they're not real. They're fake. They're someone's stolen identity that is getting used in all 50 states.
Incredible. Senator Kim, do you have anything further?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman. I mean, look, what you just laid out there, Mr. Talco, I mean, it should piss off every single American. And this is absolutely atrocious, and it just, I'm just furious, honestly, Chairman. And like, I think that there is something here, as we've tried in other hearings too, where we can work in a bipartisan way to be able to address this. You know, my job today, I'm not trying to defend any single state. I'm just saying that we can't look at it just through that lens. I mean, Mr. Talco, you were talking about this, saying the criminals are looking at this nationally. Is that right? I think that was your quote.
Yes, sir.
Then we need to make sure we're looking at this nationally too. Because it's not something that any single state is going to be able to handle on their own. Is that right, Mr. Talco? Like, no single state in our country has the capacity on their own to be able to address this.
You don't see the connections when you're looking at it within a state. You have to look at it nationally to find the connections.
Yeah, and so, you know, I think just our best opportunity here going forward to really try to deliver for the American people, because this is outrageous and should not continue on. It's just not just the scale of the money, but what it's being used for and what it's going towards. And I say that as someone who used to work counterterrorism, you know, at the Pentagon before. Like, I can't stand this. But we need to make sure we're focusing in on the criminals and thinking through, you know, what you were saying about federal law enforcement and other efforts. So, look, you know, Mr. Chairman, again, I just think that there's an opportunity here for us to come up with a comprehensive set, a menu of actions that we can take and think through what is it that we can work with this administration on, what is it that we can work through Congress on, what is it that we can empower the states to be able to step up and to be able to handle on that front. And, you know, Mr. Hedler, Gaudet, I just wanted to just follow up with you because, you know, we were talking through this about just the challenges, for instance, on the data side. You know, I had seen different reports about, for instance, usaspending.gov, right? But it seems, from my appearance, wholly inadequate right now in terms of being able to really rise to the level of the detail. I mean, I think it's admirable. We're trying to have that transparency, but would you agree that, this is something, if we're really serious about this, need to make sure that we're taking the tools that we have, investing in them to have a greater level of detail and the fidelity to really be able to try to track? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I would just note that we're actually at a kind of an interesting moment right now. We're 20-year anniversary of the passage of the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act, which was the piece of legislation, bipartisan, co-led by Senator Tom Coburn and then Senator Barack Obama, by the way, that created usaspending.gov and really tried to begin the process of bringing federal funding and the tracking of federal funding into the 21st century. We have obviously not kept up. And as I mentioned in my opening testimony, we have a long way to go to really reflect 21st century sort of technological capabilities when it comes to how we track, monitor, and assess federal spending. But it's something we can do. It's not hard. The statute is there. We have the reforms. We have the fixes. We just need to do it.
Mr. Hedler, go ahead. I just wanted to stick with you a little more. Mr. Talco was going through, 4 different ideas here: front-end identity verification, recertification, third-party audits, federal law enforcement. Did I get that right? Just wanted to get your response. If there's anything else that you want to add, any other things that this committee should be thinking about.
Yes, so all of the recommendations that Mr. Talco laid out there sound perfectly reasonable to me. I would add to build a little bit on the USA spending issue. That is supposed to be the primary interface through which the American people can trust but verify what is happening with their tax dollars. The problem is that USA spending right now is it's outdated and it doesn't require enough information to make it truly useful in the way that it needs to be. As a prime example of that, each program is required to submit award descriptions, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's supposed to tell you what that federal award is. But right now there are no standards or no guidelines around what has to be contained in an award description. So if you go on USA Spending and you try to look up like what a program is, how much money is being spent, and you look in the award description field, you're often going to see a bunch of gobbledygook that makes no sense and doesn't give you any information. And that could be easily fixed by just saying to OMB, to agencies, hey, you have to provide meaningful information when you're entering in these award descriptions into USA Spending. So there are a ton of pretty low-hanging fruit fixes like that would really help as far as the sort of transparency and trying to actualize the fact that sunlight truly is the best disinfectant.
Yeah. No, look, thank you for that. I just want to end here just saying, we take all of this effort that we're doing right now, mindful of the fact that, we live in the time of the greatest amount of distrust in government in modern American history. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think a lot of what we heard today is a big part of that. Is the sense that we can't manage our money. In fact, that we're seeing us being taken advantage of by others. And I hope we can just, in a unified way, be able to say enough. Like, we're tired of this, and we need to have that end and work earnestly to be able to address it. What I worry, though, again, is if we're sniping at each other and continuing to point attacks at each other, especially politically, the only people that benefit from that are the criminals. They're the ones that are getting away with this as we're wrestling with each other and fighting each other. Whereas if we are seriously being targeted in such a direct and malicious way by actors, then we need to make sure we are unified in terms of being able to address that and be able to do this with a clear mind. Because again, I think restoring trust is so important right now. We think about just how many legitimate beneficiaries are being taken advantage of and not getting, how the taxpayer dollars are being diverted, and how all of this is just going to continue to make it harder for us to be able to push forward. So, Mr. Chair, again, I am grateful that we have an opportunity to shine a light on this. I know we will have some disagreements in terms of, some of the priorities and some of the words that we're using. But again, I am ready to be able to engage. I think many people on the Democratic side here in the Senate would be willing to engage in this in a legitimate discussion of how we take this on nationally in a systemic way. And I just urge you and others, hopefully we can find an opportunity to do that. And with that, I'll yield back.
Senator Johnson.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I want to go back to NGOs. My assumption is NGOs are nonprofits, correct? Are there any for-profit NGOs?
That is correct, Senator.
how did they accumulate $14.1 trillion worth of assets? Where'd that money come from?
It's a great question. We've tracked over 100 million just in the last few years from the federal government. So entities in the Soros network and the Rockefeller network and the Tides network
I don't
especially.
even think Soros is, I mean,
they get grants.
It's $14 trillion. So again, that's one of the things my subcommittee is trying to investigate, is we're trying to track that back and, go back in history, and $14 trillion, non-government. Again, my assumption was these are nonprofits. They get money from government and they distribute to, worthy beneficiaries. Somehow they're pocketing $14.1 trillion. That's, okay. So there's a project for both you researchers. The reason we focus on Minnesota is we need to learn what happened in Minnesota so we can widen our aperture and see, okay, if they were able to do it in Minnesota, where else are they doing the same exact thing? Okay, so it's not, we're not trying to penalize Minnesota or one particular population. It's like, no, we have to learn from this obvious fraud and open up our aperture. Mr. Talcove, you mentioned steal at scale. Let me give you an example of one legalized stealing at scale that unfortunately one side of the aisle completely ignored. So when we passed the enhanced subsidies for Obamacare, the pandemic, the temporary one, right? We created a lot of zero premium policies. Okay, prior to the pandemic, there were about 10 million people on the exchanges. Now all of a sudden there's about 24 million, supposedly. Now we've known, because Paragon has looked at this, and because of those zero premium policies, there's probably about 6 million phantom policies. Okay, and again, no claim policies went from 20 to 40%. I mean, this is obvious fraud, right? Probably about $30 billion a year. So anybody who wanted to just go ahead and clean extension of the enhanced policies, even though we were talking about this all the time, $30 billion a year, I would call that fraud at scale. Was happy to just look the other way and facilitate that fraud. Yeah. Okay, so again, we can talk about bipartisanship, but the fact of the matter is, we've got one side of the aisle that has no problem with this. Governor Walz had no problem looking the other way. They were fully aware of it. I mean, the first audit that I saw, that was in, I think, March of 2019, a couple months after he got into office. Fully aware of this. They're not willing to do anything about it, which is why the GAO recommendations are not enacted. But I want to know, you describe stealing at scale. How do they do it? How could you funnel $14 trillion into NGOs? Yeah. How does it happen?
So go back to your Medicaid example, right? 40% of those policies, absolutely no claims. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Once you're in Medicaid and you have a valid number, then you start manipulating the bad providers and you start getting durable equipment, a catheter, orthopedics, et cetera, that are never shipped, and all of a sudden you are losing literally hundreds of billions of dollars. And what happens in government is we don't get to the lowest common denominator. The lowest common denominator is the primary care physician that gets inundated with thousands and thousands of fake patients seeking fake services and products.
But who's, step aside from Medicaid, who's accumulating this? I mean, who is behind literally how many tons of dollar bills? Minnesota, the one, well, I always heard it's 700 million, but it's $1.4 billion of cash.
Yeah, in my experience doing this 15 years, it all ends up tied back to transnational criminal organizations that facilitate the fraud and move portions of it out of the country.
Are there names for these, or are they just that shadowy?
They're state-sponsored groups. They're groups such as APT 41. These are well-known organizations that operate, and their sole purpose is to steal from American taxpayers, destabilize our democracy, and use that money for other purposes.
Mr. Bruner, again, you've, I think, part of writing a book on some of the foreign influences here. We need data. We need information. We need flowcharts. We need to, break down the $14.1 trillion, figure out where that came from, figure out if it's $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion a year in fraud. We've got to break that down and go, okay, here are the programs it's going through, and here's who's sucking it up. Because again, there's some fraud of people getting benefits that they don't deserve. Okay, that's small scale fraud. You're talking about fraud at scale that's being funneling money into, I don't know, Al-Shabaab, whatever terrorist organization, maybe some of that $7 or $1.4 billion worth of cash that went out of Minneapolis. How do we get to the bottom of this? How much research has already been done?
Yeah, well, in the example of the cash flowing out of Minneapolis, I mean, it's really shocking because it goes through this Hawala network, which is an ancient Islamic banking system. And we did a report, EB Terrorism, and it's about how money makes its way to terror groups. I mean, the figures we've talked about today, think about how much 9/11 cost. The investigation shows around 450,000. Many of the hijackers were on benefits with that. The Boston bombing, it's a pressure cooker. I mean, a couple $100, or they were on benefits. Same thing with New Orleans, the truck driver. I mean, $19.99 a day from U-Haul. So the amount of money that we're seeing go out, it needs to stop because of the amount of damage it could potentially do. Regarding the $14.1 trillion, we'll track it, but these are endowments. I mean, it's legal to hold, the buildings and the things like that. But there's so much money, it's hard for a human to comprehend $14 trillion in assets.
Okay. Well, again, this is incredibly important. Again, this is way more than fraud by individuals. These are organizations organizing this, and again, I would argue for political purpose, right? Because you go back to Minneapolis, those protests, those people just spraying out of their houses and something. No, this was highly organized. Now, I don't know, was it literally organized to turn people's attention away from the massive fraud? I know people made claims. I don't know. But all I know is the only reason Americans are furious at ICE right now is because that was ginned up. Those activists were trained to put themselves in harm's way. They got a couple martyrs. It's been incredibly effective, but it's incredibly corrosive on our body politic. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
To your question, Senator Johnson's 14,000 pounds of $100 bills. 14,000 pounds of $100 bills that left the Minneapolis airport alone. I want to end.
Hey, by the way, just real quick, the fix to there is when you see, they actually filled out the CBP forms. So it was all okay because they filled out the paperwork. Why wasn't the IRS all over their case going, where'd this money come from? So again, I hope this administration starts focusing and investigating where'd that money come from.
We've talked about some of the necessary steps that are needed here to deal with the sort of fraud and corruption that we've been talking about today. And I want to add one more to that, and that is prosecution. As a former prosecutor, there's nothing like the power of prosecution. And when you've got $60 million in dark money flowing through at least 14 different groups just for the Minnesota protests alone, to say nothing of other protests, anti-law enforcement protests we've seen around the country, many of these groups using foreign money. By the way, no foreign entity has any rights to the First Amendment in the United States of America. And when you are funneling and funding activity that is itself illegal, the assault of cops is illegal, blowing up cars on the California freeway, that's illegal. Disrupting students trying to go to school on our campuses, that's illegal. And over again, we see this money through these same networks flowing in to create these riots, these protests, these divisions. There needs to be prosecutions here. So I just renew my call to the Department of Justice to investigate these groups, these dark money groups, untangle this web, and bring prosecutions wherever you can, because the American people deserve to have control of their government, not some foreign billionaire or set of billionaires, not some shadowy group of American billionaires. It ought to be the American people, we the people, not we the billionaires, who are trying to control our discourse and, yes, our elections in many cases through their foreign money, their access, their influence. It's got to stop, and one of the best ways to stop it is with prosecution. Thank you to all of the witnesses for being here. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days. That's until Wednesday, February the 25th of this year, for the submission of statements and questions for the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you, Senator Johnson. Senator Cornyn, let me just come back to you. I want to get a handle here on just the scale of the fraud in Minnesota. We talked about the dark money groups funding much of what's going on the ground, but let's just get a handle here on the scale of the fraud. You are a member, I want to get this right, of the the Office of the Legislative Auditor. So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, of the Legislative Audit Commission.
Audit Commission, got you. You oversee the Office of the
Yes.
Legislative Auditor. Okay, got it. So you've got access to all of this information. Give me your best estimate based on the information you've seen, the audits you've seen. How many of the agencies, 20 or so agencies, I think, in the state of Minnesota, public agencies, how many have rampant fraud?
All of them are wrapped up in some sort that can issue. There's 20 primary state agencies in state law. Of the largest, there are 10 of our largest primary agencies. Many of the nonprofits receive grants and funding from all 10 agencies.
If you had to put a number on it, based on what you've seen, your work, your investigations, the audits that you've seen, what do you think the total losses are to Minnesotans in terms of fraud?
I think the conservative number is what our federal investigators have determined. Of just the 14 Medicaid programs, that half of all of it would be about $9 billion. And I don't think that's, and I think the reason I believe that's true is in each audit that the legislative auditor produces, we measure right level in the samples of what they have done. 20 to 80% of each one of them, they're unable to prove that the dollars were actually have gone to the programs in which they're indicated.
$9 billion. How much of this money has left Minnesota for overseas?
Well, I arrived in 2017. The Child Care Assistance Program fraud, for which the program, I believe, is $130 million. The whistleblowers proved or showed us that they believe $100 million of that was fraudulent. We had a whistleblower come forward, actually publicly, and at that time we also discovered something new to me, which is the Hawala process of the movement of cash through our airports in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And what I've come to learn, and that year it was just coincidentally $100 million in fraud, suspected fraud, and $100 million went out in cash through the Minneapolis St. Paul airport. I've learned that.
Tell us how that worked. $100 million in cash through the airport.
In suitcases, back then it was $1 million at a crack. And so I've learned that in the year before it was about $74 million. Secretary Bessent I've tried for 2.5 years to get that number because I wanted to get a view of how many excess dollars are sent out from the program, from the community that's sending them. And in the last 2 years, it was $340 million each year. And so if you look at it, it's about a 25% increase over this period from 2017. That's $1.8 billion in cash. And I don't think the average citizen who works for their money understands how complicated it is to ship or to obtain $6 to $7 million of cash every single week of of the year. And our federal government certainly must have been aware of it and has done nothing to look at it. But that's just all but about $130 million, I think, is originated out of Minnesota.
You know, but what every American taxpayer absolutely understands is their federal tax money being taken on suitcases out of this country to go heaven knows where. I mean, if that's not infuriating, I don't know what is. And the fact that it is systemic in Minnesota, and probably to your testimony, Mr. Talco, probably systemic in a lot of other places. I mean, millions of dollars in suitcases out of an airport, and that's just one means of shipping this money around. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. I want to come back to you, Mr. Talco. You testified that about $1 trillion you think is lost in fraud every year. Where's this money going? I mean, we know where some of it's going in Minnesota. It went overseas. It went to Somalia. It went to NGO fronts. We know where it's gone in some other states. California gave away billions of dollars to a pro-Hamas NGO. But $1 trillion nationally, where's this money going to?
I appreciate that question because most people don't ask that question. It goes to terrorism. It goes to child trafficking. It goes to drugs. It goes to terrorism. And then it's used to purchase luxury items, cars, purses, homes. That's all funded by people like me that pay taxes.
So you're telling me that the electrician who goes to work every day and clocks in and works his butt off and tries to earn just enough to be able to, make his rent, maybe have a kid or two, put food on the table, his tax money is being used to buy other people luxury items, cars, yachts, whatever else, and is going to fund terrorism and child trafficking?
Yes, sir.
$1 trillion a year on this stuff?
$115 million an hour.
$115 million an hour. How do they get their hands on it? What are we talking about here? Transnational organizations, criminal networks? How do they get their hands on this money?
They take advantage of antiquated government systems and processes. They go into programs that they know elected and appointed officials won't touch, and they can steal at scale. And what happened really was during the pandemic, between the PPP loans and the unemployment insurance, they learned a really valuable lesson. Government never runs out of money, and the probability of getting caught is virtually zero. I have it at 0.1%.
So come back to the recommendations that you mentioned in your opening statement. What do we need to do to put a stop to this hemorrhaging of people's hard-earned money going overseas to finance child trafficking and luxury yachts? I mean, what needs to happen here?
It's really simple. It's used every single day in the commercial sector. Front-end identity verification, you just don't get to say, I am who I say I am. Second, recertification of all the recipients. There is so much fraud right now in the benefit programs all across the country. We need to get a baseline. Third, this notion of a third-party independent audit. And finally, is involving federal law enforcement, like the Secret Service, to investigate it. The thing that people don't understand is that most of these beneficiaries, Senator, they're not real. They're fake. They're someone's stolen identity that is getting used in all 50 states.
Incredible. Senator Kim?
What you just watched is exactly why moments like this keep spreading across the country. Not because people are looking for another loud political clip, but because deep down, millions of Americans can feel that something is broken. And when somebody finally says out loud what everyone else is thinking, it hits hard. Josh Hawley didn't just challenge a witness here. He challenged the whole machinery that protects people in power. The carefully crafted language, the rehearsed denials, the vague answers, the endless effort to bury simple truths under mountains of procedure. All of it starts to collapse the moment someone refuses to play along. And that is why moments like this matter. Because once the public sees that the people in charge can be cornered, questioned, and exposed in real time, it changes the entire feeling of the hearing. It stops being theater and starts feeling like accountability. And that's really the bigger story here. Whether the issue is fraud, big tech, the safety of children, government secrecy, or abuse of power, the pattern is always the same. Somebody hopes the public isn't paying attention. Somebody assumes the language is too complex, the paperwork is too dense, or the media cycle is too fast for ordinary people to follow. But then one sharp question lands. One receipt gets pulled out. One contradiction gets exposed. And suddenly, the whole room changes. The confidence disappears. The smiles fade. The talking points stop working. That's why these clips connect so strongly with viewers, because they don't just show conflict. They show a shift in power. They show the moment someone who thought they were protected realizes they may not be protected after all. And for people watching at home, that moment is deeply satisfying. It feels like a crack in the wall. It feels like the kind of truth that was never supposed to get daylight. So now the question goes to you. After everything you just saw, do you think this was just another hearing, or do you think this was a warning shot to the entire system? Do you think Hawley exposed something bigger than the witness in front of him? And if he did, how many more people are hoping you never see clips like this? If you think the truth hit hard today, go down to the comments right now and type Hawley. Not because it's just a slogan, but because it tells the algorithm that people are still paying attention, still thinking, and still willing to push this message further. Hit like if you want more unfiltered moments like this. Share this video with someone who still believes these hearings are just political performance. And subscribe if you want the next clip before it gets buried under the next news cycle. Because the real reason videos like this matter is simple. Once people start seeing the pattern, they can't unsee it. And once that happens, the people hiding behind the curtain start running out of places to hide.